Hello, and welcome to the Conversations in Time podcasts from the ORC. In this podcast, the guys will be talking about historical what-ifs, or counterfactual history for the aficionados in the audience.
Hello, and welcome to another podcast from... Jeez, I'm having one of them days again.
Well, it's the weather, isn't it? It's lethargic weather, lethargic individuals.
That's right, yeah. Hello, and welcome to another Conversations in Time podcast from the ORC, or the Official Retired Club. I'm John N.
And I'm Ian G.
So, today we're back on the Counterfactual Universe bus and heading a bit further back in time, and potentially our first foray to a new place. And where's that then, Ian?
Well, I hope it's the First World War, because I'm not sure that's as far back as we've gone in time before, but I suppose we've never been to the First World War before.
No, that's right, yeah, we haven't been to the first.
Yeah. So what we're going to do today is discuss what might have happened if the Americans hadn't joined the French and the British and Empire forces in the First World War, again, primarily in the Western Theatre in France. So what would be the consequences of them not turning up? As I said to John a minute, the Yanks aren't here, as opposed to the Yanks are here.
Well, it's as if the Yanks aren't coming.
You're right. Get the name of the song right. The Yanks aren't coming. The Yanks aren't here is probably some other song, but the Yanks aren't coming. The most famous song for UK visitors, completely ruined by some what is it? Some sort of comparison website advert for the last 10 years. But never mind. I was accused the other day. Why are you whistling that song from the Go Compare? And I said, look, it's actually a very well-known First World War song. The Yanks are coming. But I was told to stop whistling anyway. But then that's a by the by. So what might have happened if the Americans hadn't arrived in 1917? Actually, three years late. But never mind.
So one of the things that could have happened was that at the time the US was doing a more isolationist approach to certainly to Western Europe, and something called the Monroe Doctrine, which was about potentially having the US influencing the West but not having alliances. It was something echoed by George Washington. I mean, it's a bit earlier, but ultimately that was where it sort of started.
But wasn't the Monroe Doctrine really more a question of not inflated, basically saying to the European powers, South America and Central America's our backyard. We're going to, it's our backyard.
That's right, yeah.
Our backyard. Yeah.
Sod off. Yeah.
So it wasn't a benevolent, instruction. It was more a question of, if we feel like we're going to dally in these countries, we're going to dally in these countries. It's nothing to do with you. Mind your own business.
That's right. Yeah. It was warning European powers against further colonisation or intervention in the Americas, because it was for them to colonise and intervene.
Oh, perish the thought. But yes, it's but yeah.
But at the end of the day, the policy was being followed through. It was George Washington's farewell address, where he cautioned against entangling alliances with foreign nations, and which essentially carried on up until the First World War.
Yes, apart from entangling with France
in Europe
during the entangling with France during the American Revolution, which probably certainly enabled him to win more quickly and possibly win full stop. But that's a completely different conversation.
Why was there? Is there American?
The French Navy essentially prevented the British Navy from leveraging its domination in the Caribbean.
The French Revolution.
No, the American Revolution.
Oh, no. Yeah, I don't know. I understand that. No, you said French Revolution.
Did I?
You did.
Okay.
Well, I thought
for the benefit of the tape, I don't think I did, but if I did, my apologies.
Back and then,
Anyway, well, no, the American Revolution. I think, to be fair, most of my knowledge around that has been told by you to me. So I thought it was a bit odd that you were questioning it. But if I did say French, I meant American. Sorry.
Yeah. So that was earlier. So this is 1796, the George Washington farewell address.
Yeah.
But arguably, up until the First World War, America essentially stayed out of anything to do with Western Europe.
Apart from Spain, of course.
apart from Spain.
Well, in the sense that they were happy to take over Spanish colonies by force.
But that was part of the Monroe Doctrine, though, wasn't it?
Long way from the Philippines is central.
Well,
south.
yeah.
But anyway, maybe that was just an accident. We accidentally had a colony, but anyway, but you're absolutely right. I mean, essentially, their avowed policy was one of isolationist. Whether that stood up to great or much scrutiny is a different conversation altogether. But that was their avowed policy.
Yeah. So we're going to make the assumption that they essentially stayed neutral. So not necessarily doing what they did at the beginning of the First World War, which was to provide financial support to the Allies, but essentially remain neutral. I mean, it's funny. There's FDR, so Franklin D. Roosevelt, was also of the opinion that America should have stayed out of the First World War, and thought Woodrow Wilson made a big mistake in providing or intervening. So it was, this wasn't something, it was a fairly serious potential. I feel that.
Well,
I'm just looking up who it was who actually who suggested the idea in the first place. Which was
what idea?
Secretary of State William Jennings Bryan. He was the one who provided. He was trying to push Woodrow Wilson into a real neutrality rather than a sham one. So Bryan.
Well, what makes you think it was a sham neutrality?
Well, because they were providing funds to France and Britain. And
they were to do what though?
Wage this war.
Well, all right, but okay. I mean, I don't think
So they were providing money.
Well, okay, but they were presumably providing materiel as well. On the basis that if you could come and get it, you could have it, and patently the Germans couldn't come and get it because there's the minor issue
right. So this
of the biggest navy in the world being in the way, sort of thing, So
William Jennings Bryan was saying we should, be properly neutral and bar both sides from being able to buy war material in the US.
What, and cause a recession in America? It seems unlikely there would be that.
Would it have been who knows whether it would have been a recession? I don't know enough about the economics of the US at the time. It was certainly, I don't think they would have been destitute in the US without a war in Europe. I'm not sure that was. Don't forget they'd had an isolationist policy for.
Well, indeed, but
a long time.
They were becoming the world's, if not they were by then, the world's biggest economy. So it's difficult to refuse perfectly reasonable attempts to buy stuff. But that's kind of by the by. But yeah.
So let's just make the assumption that they agreed and that the US, stayed neutral.
Yeah, in terms of
far enough away to
armed conflict.
Yeah. Right. So the war starts, and I mean, the early phases of the war probably wouldn't have been that much different.
No, can't see how they could be. The wherewithal to fight the war, or such as it was, because there was massive shortages in the British Army, for example, the so-called shell shortage in 1915. But the availability of munitions had very little to do with America, really, at that point. Certainly for years. I mean, if you look at the huge army that France had already deployed, and the huge army that Britain ultimately built under Kitchener, the volunteer army that was semi-destroyed at the Somme, that was in no way equipped by American munitions or anything. So you can run through to 1917, essentially when the Americans joined, and say, well, the Americans were neutral. So even if they'd been more a Swiss type neutral state.
Well, would it have got? I mean, there's an argument you could say that would it have got that far ultimately, because by 1917, Britain and France were getting support from, even though it was material type support.
Well, they were getting support from. They were buying stuff. I don't know.
All right, they were buying stuff, and but they were getting it. If they were, they
were getting it because they could go and get it. The Germans could have it as well if you can go and get it. So the Americans weren't acting out of anything other than self-interest.
So we have to at least say what the scenario is then. So. In the William Jennings Bryan solution is that you don't sell them anything to do with the war.
Yeah.
Right. So either we say that that's something that happens, or we say no, they're prepared to profit from anybody buying what they want as long as they can come and fetch it.
Yeah.
So which one do you think is the more realistic?
Well, I think the most realistic one is the Americans do what they always do. They'll sell anything to anybody. But they so.
All right. Well, that's fine. I just want to make sure that we're working to the same
especially
guidelines.
if it's a perfectly legitimate state. Why would they not? I mean, and France and Britain weren't particularly dependent upon American material anyway. I mean, there's a huge difference between that and the Second World War, obviously. But in the First World War, Britain was the premier navy by X. So the navy. French was the biggest army in the world. There was no requirement for America to do anything other than make a profit, which is fair enough. But they weren't supplying anything that was particularly crucial or unique. All
right. So just in this scenario, this counterfactual, we're saying that when feasible, the Americans would profit from selling whatever they could.
Yeah, I think the most likely
whoever they could.
Yeah, the most likely scenario is that they just don't join the armed conflict.
Yeah, but don't forget, we're talking about having actually being on the side of the Allies rather than being.
Yeah, but they're not on the side of the Allies.
Not on anybody's side.
They're just selling.
So the war bonds that the US did to provide extra funding to the Allies, that didn't go to Germany. Germany didn't have access to that finance.
Yeah, because there was no expectation the Germans would be able to pay it back. The British Empire was.
But you don't know that at the time. The Germans might have won the first.
Yeah, but even if they'd won, what's the likelihood that the Kaiser's going to pay it back? Britain's always paid its debts. Germany's been through.
Say that Germany wouldn't. There's no way. I don't know what your evidence is to say.
Well, Germany had only existed for 35 years, or give or take, by that stage. I mean, it was a confederate. You wouldn't. It's a bit like loaning money to a newly, banks loaning money to a country that joins the EU. They're going to have to be slightly doubtful if Serbia or Albania. When they join the EU, you're going to just give them loads of money on the basis they pay it back. But they'll have some doubts.
Yeah, but there's still the case. That doesn't mean to say it wouldn't have happened. All I'm saying is that.
Yeah, but what if the Germans got to sell back? In an event, look what happened in the Second World War. That we got 50 rusty old destroyers from America and gave away various rights to Caribbean islands and stuff for the American Navy. The Germans didn't have anything of that nature in the First World War to pay off their debts with. There was nothing that America wanted that Germany had that they could leverage. I mean, there's some colonies in Africa and such like, but again, they've been anti-colonial. But you're right. I mean, you're right. I mean, the Americans patently were more sympathetic to the British and French than they were the Germans. I don't really see how that. There's a lot of Germans in America, but I really don't see how that would. I can see how, of self-interest, they might choose not to become an armed. That's a term I can't think of it, but an armed partner. But in terms of selling stuff, yeah, fill your boots. I think it's come and get it. I mean, they did that for many a year 3 years before they joined the actual conflict. But I suppose there are two scenarios. It's possible they wouldn't do that and be a Swiss-type neutral country, although even that's a bit questionable. There's probably some country out there somewhere that's completely neutral all the time and doesn't do any shenanigans. So let's assume if they did that, that's fine.
All right, so let's move forward then. So now US involvement from a physical impact. So what do we think the outcome of the war would be post 1917?
Well, I guess is what we've.
It's seen as a tipping point. So either it was a tipping point or it wasn't.
It wasn't a tipping point in 19. I mean, it depends what your definition of a tipping point is, but it didn't have. I mean, let's look at what actually did happen briefly. Is obviously the Russians surrendered. That released dozens, 50, 60 divisions. A division being about 53,000 soldiers.
Wasn't it Lenin who?
Yeah, well,
he didn't surrender. Didn't he just say, "Well, we're not fighting you anymore"? And they signed some deal. Yeah, the deal of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. That meant that they didn't have to fight so they essentially stopped fighting. Okay, but they didn't surrender.
Occupied.
Yeah.
Well, one side stops fighting, the other side wants to keep fighting.
Yeah, but they didn't take any. They didn't carry on. I mean, I don't know whether they handed land back or
no. What. They basically kept the lands that they'd already got in terms of what is now modern day Poland and a bit of
Yeah, so it wasn't. All I'm saying, it wasn't a surrender. It was
but that released 60 divisions that could be made available on the Western Front. So they then appear in the Spring Offensive in 1918. So the Spring Offensive was done in the spring. I mean, part of the obvious reason you could try not to fight in the winter to defeat the Western Allies, France, Britain, and as was America, before American troops turned up en masse. So you could argue that what happened. The Germans attacked. Their advance was eventually stopped at great loss, and then they'd shot their bolt. And over the next 3 months or 4 months, the British, French, and to a certain extent the Americans then defeated the German army in the field. So the question is, had the Americans not been there, what would have happened? That's the biggest question, I guess. So I suppose you could look at it and say, would the Germans have been in such a hurry if they knew? Well, they wouldn't have known because it would have happened. But would the Germans have been in such a hurry if there was no American forces arriving? Probably not. But then, as I said, spring/summer is the time of year when you have an offensive. Would the offensive have been stopped if the Americans weren't there? Well, the Americans at that point hadn't delivered huge volumes of troops. By today's standard they had, but by the standards of the French army, and even to a certain extent the British army, which was smaller than the French army, the Americans were 200,000 or 300,000 troops, which is huge numbers by today's standards. But the British army was 1 million, French army was 3 million.
I think there was 3 million. I was looking it up. There was 3 million British troops, and there's 1.3 million Indian, 500,000 Australian, and obviously several other Commonwealth countries provided support.
Yeah, I'm using them as British, but okay, I'm under. But the Americans didn't. It's the concept of the Americans rather than the Americans. If they would actually turned up. Yes, there were some battles that they defeat the Germans at in a defensive sense, and yes, they took collectively over the First World War a huge number of casualties by today's standards. But it was not so much what they did in the battles. Yes, they did very well in the battles and all the rest of it, but it was the other X million potential soldiers sitting in America that was the real threat. Because once they turned up, I mean, Germany, whether Germany thought they could win is debatable, but they certainly wouldn't win
they're not turning up. So do we think that the French and the British would have pushed the Germans back?
I think the answer is yes, because the
you don't think it would have ended up in some form of stalemate where, they might have pushed them back, but would they have pushed them back enough to? No, because you've got to remember
victory? That this is the issue where is the Second World War just phase 2 of the First World War? But there's two.
We'll come on to that in a minute. So
there's two reasons that the Germans were defeated. They were defeated in the field, and they were defeated at home by being starving to death. The Royal Navy blockade, obviously with the French as well, but the Royal Navy plague was killing thousands of civilians every day by the 1918s of starvation, which equals also illnesses caused by lack of robustness. So it's at the end of the day not necessarily were these people, all of them, starving, but they were certainly starving and then getting illnesses which were associated with poor health. So there was and this is where the stab in the back nonsense came up from the Nazis, that the civilians gave up before the army, but the army was defeated in the field. The army was defeated in the field by a change of tactics. Obviously, there was the use of tanks. Tanks weren't any magic bullet as such, but the use of tanks, the use of artillery barrages that crept towards the enemy, the use of spotting aircraft and to identify gains and reinforcing gains rather than just en masse attacks. So there was a huge change of tactics that had been developed by the British and the French, obviously, by learning all mistakes. Admittedly, why it took 1 million British and give or take, or 800,000 British and Commonwealth soldiers and 2 or 3 million French to die to learn these lessons is another story. But I don't actually think the Americans made a great deal of difference to the push of the Germans back to their borders. Yes, they won. There was famous battles.
When I look it up, and there are a few people who have looked at this as a counterfactual, and the argument's very much more, well, Germany could have won, or it would have been a stalemate, not it would have just been the same.
Would these by any chance be American sources you're looking at?
I don't know. That could be.
What does the audience think? But our American audience can let us know.
Of course, one of the things that we're trying to avoid is that if we go down the route of, well, it just stays the same, then we may as well finish the episode now, because it doesn't make any difference. Germany still loses. This is Treaty of Versailles.
The Treaty of Versailles would be completely different, because that was determined by Wilson, by and large. He was holding the ring and persuading people not to be too vindictive, and they didn't have a great deal of luck in that regard. But there was lots of headback.
He supposedly weakened it, so the Treaty of Versailles would have been a lot harsher had it not been for Woodrow Wilson.
That's what I just said. That's what I just said. So we're going back to this stalemate then. What pivotal defensive battle was the responsibility of the Americans? I mean, the Australians kept large chunks of the British army in place by being a rear guard, but I'm not aware of any battle where the Americans saved the day. I'm not disputing that they lost many troops and fought well, but they just didn't have the numbers, and they didn't have the experience, and they didn't have the time.
I suppose we're at this point now where you're looking at it as just there weren't any American troops, and I'm looking at it as America wasn't involved in the First World War, and there's a difference between those two perspectives.
Well, agreed. But I'm also saying that the British and French economies outstripped the American economy. Well, you could do the maths, but it certainly probably is twice as big, maybe 1.5 times as big. Britain and France were not dependent upon America in the First World War, anything like in the way that they were in the Second War. Britain was in the Second World War. So there's nothing coming from America that is unique, and there's not volume coming from America that is. I suppose arguably the biggest thing is foodstuffs, but we're not suggesting that America would either interdict foodstuffs, do a totally neutral thing in saying, or are we? If they were to go completely neutral and say you can't have these warlike materials going past our coast from Canada, wheat and such like, and you can't have beef from Argentina going up through the middle of the Caribbean stroke to the middle of the Atlantic, and we're going to interdict that. I mean, I suppose that would be an act of war, so they wouldn't do that. But and would they say we're not going to sell foodstuffs to the UK? Because as we know, if the transatlantic trade from Canada and America and the rest of South America and round the Horn from the Cape of Good Hope from Australia and stuff, or through the Med or wherever, if that were interdicted, Britain starves. We know that. It's true of today as it was 100 years ago. But I just don't see the American economy. Yes, a very big economy, probably number one in the world.
But your argument then is that, what you're saying is that if people have a view that the American intervention in the First World War actually made a difference, that's not true.
It didn't make any difference. It did make a difference.
Well, not based on what you just said.
It didn't. I don't think it made a difference to the outcome.
That's what we're talking about, is the outcome of the First World War.
The difference is that if you got it up there, 100,000 American soldiers died. That would have been 100,000 French and British and Commonwealth soldiers, Empire and Commonwealth. So there's 100,000 British and Empire and Commonwealth soldiers died, who were otherwise American. So it was very much a tactical. Whether it had an impact on the stiffening of resolve, if you like, in the French and in British governments, I can't speak for the French.
Well, maybe it would be nice to think that your perspective might create some comments from our listeners.
Well, indeed, but
they think, the Americans definitely had a significant impact on the First World War.
The comparison to the Second World War is huge.
Yeah, but we're not talking about World War II.
Well, no, but my point being is that the difference it's huge is because it's completely different. The British economy was much stronger in 1914 than it was in 1940. The French economy is knocked out, obviously, so we're standing alone with British Commonwealth and Empire countries. But that wasn't the case, So it's almost, you could almost argue, what would be the case if Australia hadn't joined the First World War? Well, the economies are tiny in comparison, but in terms of fighting soldiers, probably similar. In terms of those that were actually deployed. But nobody would seriously say, well, if Australia hadn't helped Britain in the First World War, it wouldn't have won. Again, it would have been an awful lot harder, an awful lot more dead people in these islands, but not the end result. I just can't see it. I just can't see it. But I'm interested to know who these people are who say it would be a stalemate and couldn't have won. Couldn't have won how? Because, without being totally chauvinistic about it, the innovation.
You can be if you want. Don't worry.
The innovations.
You don't have that many listeners.
That's true. The innovations that the British Army developed in the last year of the war were streets ahead of the French, and the Americans hadn't even learned the lessons of the mistakes yet. Never mind the innovations of how to do it. And going into it again, creeping barrages, tanks, reinforcing success. They won't be fairly obvious, but they're only obvious in benefit hindsight 100 years later. The use of radio communications to direct artillery, etc., etc. The Americans were still very badly equipped. They had no air force. They had no air force at the end of the war. They were using French aircraft. They had no artillery to speak of. They were using the French 75mm, which became quite famous in America. It's a cocktail even today, I believe. They had no. They had a squad machine gun at the start of the Second World War, which was a Lewis gun, which they had tons of because they were making them for the British. They had a BAR, which was developed at the end of the war. That wasn't deployed in any huge numbers. So yes, they could turn up with a big army, equipped by the French for artillery, equipped by the British, inverted commas, by the fact that we'd already been paying for many of these weapons, and they'd been making them. If they'd been completely neutral going down that, they wouldn't have made them. So I don't know how Britain would have struggled, arguably, but I can't see America being that neutral it wouldn't sell weapons to a completely bona fide country like the UK. So I just. All right, not. It must admit, it's not. If you think about it, John, it's not one that pops up in popular consciousness very often for a good reason, because I don't think it would make much difference. But I'm happy to be.
Well, that's clear. Yeah.
Well, at least I haven't said they'd drop a nuclear bomb on Berlin. But but I'm happy to be proven wrong. Or to be persuaded wrong. I mean, if there's some silver bullet somewhere, I don't know. But
I don't know enough about the First World War to know that. Well, if the Americans hadn't have been there and the tactics had changed, Germany would have done this, and they either would have won or they wouldn't have lost, and then it would have been a stalemate. But
I don't think. I think the stalemate, days were gone. I mean, I think the stalemate days were gone. The use of the various things which I've gone through, and there's a couple of other things which I haven't mentioned. Those tactics. The interesting thing is that, and not a lot of people know this, as somebody once said, is that the last year of the war wasn't in your mind, people have got this picture of trenches, rows of trenches with zigzags occasionally to stop, the entire trench being taken out. That wasn't the case in the last year of the war, because artillery had got so powerful that you could not sit in a trench because you'd be killed. So in actual fact, the front lines, and this was true mostly in the German front lines because British and French artillery got so overpowering, they were miles from the front, because if they were too close to the front, they'd all be killed in the first barrage. And they had some troops out in little foxholes, not trenches, but foxholes, dotted around, who would, and that's not something that's well known, but it's obvious when you think about it, because if you can destroy a trench line with all artillery, why would you have all your soldiers sitting in it? And yes, I know that the Germans had deep dugouts, and yes, I know they occasionally had concrete pillboxes and all the rest of it, but again, that you cannot put a division of 20,000 people in half a dozen concrete pillboxes and deep dugouts. So you kept them, and that's again the overwhelming British artillery and French artillery changed the battlefield in the last year. And again, because your troops are further back from the front line, if you get a breakthrough in the era of mostly horse-drawn vehicles and occasional some lorries and stuff, you can't move them around very quickly. And if you do move them around again, you're vulnerable to British artillery. So a lot had changed in the last year. A lot was learned, and I just don't see how that's mitigated by the fact that you haven't got American somethings.
Well, I mean, it's going the way it's going. I mean, in some ways, it's a shame that we didn't talk about or we didn't agree that the US could stay out of the First World War entirely and not provide any support, because it would have had a bigger.
Why would they do that?
Well, because it's a counterfactual universe.
Well, yeah, but you've got. Yeah. Well, no, I'm not disputing. Yeah, fair enough. But you've got to have a reason for somebody doing that, haven't you?
Well, like I said, we had that guy saying a true neutrality and not providing.
Yeah, but this was the era in America of, not unlike today, but with not the tech bros. This was the era of the great big railway barons and the.
No, I know. So there's no doubt that, as you said at the beginning, there was an economic boom from providing the Allies with equipment. But if they hadn't have done that boom, I'm just saying that. Well, if that hadn't have happened, then the economics in the US would have been different, because they wouldn't have had the big boom.
The so-called Roaring Twenties was the boom of
the 20s. Well, there were other things as well. I mean, I'm just looking at one of the chatbots or the chat GPTs was saying when I asked it the question, and it was saying that the economic boom resulting from the Allies would not have occurred.
It didn't occur in Britain, though.
Possibly delaying America's emergence as a global economic.
So that's very American-centric. The
absence of post-war economic disruptions like the Great Depression, because that came after, there was a big boom and then there's obviously a bust, might have influenced long-term. I mean, these are might have influenced long-term economic stability.
Well, Chat GPT's wrong apart from anything else. That's far too American-centric. Unless it's only talking about America. There was no boom in Britain in the 1920s.
Well, no, I asked it about America. That's why it's talking about
Well, okay, that's fair enough. For somebody out there is probably saying, what with the general strike in 1926 in the UK, there was dreadful depressions in the early 20s in Britain. The depression in the 30s was just worse. But it's an interesting point. But my point would be that, which is true of the 1950s, that the late 40s and 50s in America, and even all the way to the 60s, is that, wars drive innovation, wars drive production line methods, which then at the end of the war can be made into cars and fridges and all this of it. And that was certainly true mostly in America in the 1920s. But my argument would be that the American culture and psyche is not to be neutral in the sense of not selling stuff to perfectly legitimate countries, even if they're at war. And therefore, the boom could have still happened, or would have still happened, because their economy would be booming by virtue of selling stuff to Britain and France, albeit Britain and France would be loaning money from America, which could have then caused a huge bust in the late 20s or early 1930s in the same way it did. It's a Ponzi scheme. You're loaning them money to so that they can buy stuff from you. Well, at some point, if one of them defaults, you're in trouble. But that's true of all economics, even today. So I think the boom could have happened.
All right, so let's just
the Germans would have still been defeated, and we all know what happened with that.
All right, so let's move on from beyond that then.
Yeah.
So, and we come to the Treaty of Versailles, right? So no US, so therefore no Woodrow Wilson influence.
Trying to stop people being totally vindictive. Yeah, agreed. Yeah.
So that means that what would have been imposed on Germany would have been, I mean, and I don't know what France and Britain were looking at that was watered down by Woodrow Wilson, but obviously that's what happened. So
I don't know either. I mean, it was fairly harsh already, but yeah, I guess it could have been harsher.
Well, it seems like it was harsh, but they obviously wanted it. Either wanted more money or they wanted to.
I think the French wanted all German industry dismantled and taken to France. Which didn't happen. Obviously, the French, I think it was mostly French. There was a bit of the Rhineland was occupied by French army that left in the 1920s, and then it was a demilitarized zone which Hitler just walked into. I guess that could have been a larger part of Germany. I mean, I suppose you could argue, a counterfactual, is that if they'd been harsher, perhaps there wouldn't have been the rise of the Nazis, because every time Hitler tried, there wouldn't have been any appeasement. When he walked into the Rhineland, it wouldn't have been the Rhineland. It could have been bigger. And maybe the French would have said, "You're not going to do that," and he would have stopped. And like most politicians, lost his job.
Or it would have been later. I mean, I think that if the treaty had been harsher, then I think Germany still would have seen it in the same way. But it would have taken a bit longer for them to get to the point where Hitler was, and it could have been too late then. It could have been the 50s rather than the 30s.
Yeah, well, but that's the biggest counterfactual of all, which we'll have to do one day. But then it was Hitler unique. I mean, he was unique. He was unique in the sense
time, yeah. And was he the wrong man at the wrong time? Oh, yeah,
yes, exactly. So he was. German nationalism had been running for since Bismarck, and would have run without Hitler. But whether it had turned into what it ultimately turned into, who else would have persuaded the Germans to go to that unique brand of evil rather than just general nationalism, which ultimately always falls on its arse in any country, because economic reality hits the nonsense that people spout. Who are these people? But whether it's hard to imagine that Germany was always going to go down that path without Hitler. And look at some of his alternatives: Himmler, a grubby little man. What's his name? Goering, a ridiculous man, etc., etc.
That's World War II.
Hitler wasn't ridiculous in his own right, but yeah.
All right, so let's think of something else then, or something else that came out of the First World War that was a Woodrow Wilson thing. But if the US was still isolationist, selling stuff, but still isolationist, then Woodrow Wilson's League of Nations, would that have happened? I mean, he was the principal.
But as you may remember, his League of Nations, America didn't join it. You have to Google it, but I'm pretty so because the Senate and or Congress, whichever it would be, both for all I know, they didn't ratify it. So the League of Nations existed, but America wasn't part of it.
But he was the guy who was pushing.
No, 100%. This is why.
So if they hadn't been in the First World War, and the idea of it was,
so the League of Nations probably wouldn't have existed. But I mean, if you think the UN's bad, and the UN is bad, but useless. But
we're trying to get to the point of, well, that wouldn't have happened then, or it certainly would have.
No, the League of Nations wouldn't have happened. But then maybe again, we could maybe a NATO equivalent would have happened instead, which arguably has been more.
Why would there be a NATO one if America's got an isolationist policy?
Well, no, I was going to exclude America from it. But if there's no League of Nations where countries can yak at each other, do they then think, well, if it's not diplomacy, it's defence, and do they have more formal pacts? Because the British and French allyship was always the entente cordiale is by its definition unwritten, doesn't include anybody else, doesn't include so we at that point we have pacts with individual countries, Belgium and etc. So again, speculation, but would that have caused? It's a bit like the threat of Trump withdrawing America from NATO. Is that then arguably makes Europeans look a bit more at each other and think, well, if we can't rely on American firepower, we have to have our own firepower. Now, whether Europe was in that mode in 1920, I don't really think so, to be honest. But it's interesting. But the League of Nations was deemed to be very ineffective. Couldn't even persuade Italy not to invade Abyssinia, or Ethiopia as now is, in the 1930s. Didn't do anything about anything really. But I guess it was a principled body. It was the right thing to do, just didn't work.
It doesn't work when it comes to armed conflict. He might have a better track record in other aspects.
Yes,
of
I just don't know, to be honest, without googling it. But it's as history sees it as a ineffective. I mean, why on earth they think the UN's any better is a bit of a mystery, frankly. But never mind. But what's the UN ever done for anybody? But
it's got no teeth, so it's never going to bite anybody.
No, and it's got people in charge of human rights who have no human rights in their own country, which is totally bizarre. But we digress. But
look that one up, listeners. Yeah.
Well, I know exactly. How is it possible that the people in charge of women's rights can be Iran? Anyway, you couldn't make it up. I literally couldn't make it up. Or chairing the.
Well, like I said, maybe we live in a counterfactual universe, and then there's people like us who are going, I wonder if.
So my job is not my role, shall we say, is not to poo-poo things. I'm quite strong in my regard. I just don't actually think it would have made any difference. I don't think the Americans made a huge difference, other than they were welcome. They did a lot of sacrifice by modern standards. The sacrifice of their troops was tremendous. Lots of brave guys. Strategically, however, I don't think they made a huge difference. They would have done had the war gone on much longer, and arguably the Germans were scared of them in regards of their potential, and therefore maybe they wouldn't have attacked in 1918. Maybe they'd have fallen back in and defended with these extra 60 divisions. But they were starving at home. They had to win. They were running out of resources, as they always were.
No, that's right.
So it was more
the Navy did its job, which was to prevent Germany getting resources.
It was the concept. There's a term in naval strategy called a fleet in being. So the German fleet in the first war was a fleet in being. You don't actually have to go out on the sea to be a threat. If nothing else, you tie up the enemy's resources. So the concept of the American forces must have weighed heavily on the Germans, and it caused them to attack to try and win the war. That exposed them. Their attack didn't work. None of that would have happened because there was no threat of the Americans. So they could have sat back, thought of other means of winning the war, whatever they might have been. They could have said, they could have gone elsewhere for the resources. They could have gone back to the Russians and said, we want Ukraine, the breadbasket of what became the Soviet Union, etc., etc. That would have fed them. They could have gone somewhere else, but they didn't do any of that because they were scared of the Americans or the potential of the Americans. So yeah, I get that there are counterfactuals, but in terms of it, how many paths we go down, they didn't do that. They attacked.
Well, let's hope that we get some listeners to this one, and as ever, please provide us any feedback, good or bad, on our Twitter page, which is ORC_time. And you can, if you listen to this on Spotify, I believe there's a way of providing some feedback. You can get one of the things we never say about this podcast is you can get this podcast where you get your podcast from. But if you're listening to it, obviously you've already done that. Maybe that's for an advert if we ever do one. I've listened to enough adverts for other people's podcasts. Well, I
think it's just the easiest way of describing it because there are multiple platforms, aren't there? I'll tell you what it is, dude. If anybody's listening on YouTube, please tell us how you find our podcast.
That's on YouTube videos, not YouTube music.
Oh, right, okay,
that's right. You can find it on YouTube music, relatively straightforward.
But yeah, it is a bit of a pain. And obviously, there's Twitter as well, ORC_time.
So, thanks for listening. I think we've come to a conclusion, or we'll just be repeating ourselves for the 7th time. Thanks again for listening. Look out for us for the next episode. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
That's it. Now, we want to hear what you think. So those of you who are part of the Twitterati or X-rated or whatever it is these days, you can leave your comments, good or bad, at ORC_time. We love your feedback. Remember, if you liked this podcast, tell your friends. And if you didn't, tell your friends.